Well, good morning. We are, as Ed was saying, at the end of a series on this idea of discover, and the power that the Bible has with adding those two little letters to a host of words. Redeemed, reconciled for those English majors out there, restored. I mean, you go down the list and it just goes on and on and on and on. And as I was planning for the day, I actually was going the direction Ed was going, which, by the way, I'm going to look out and see the car. And by the way, it is a sweet-looking car. It looks like is it a Camaro? No, it's not a Camaro. I can't see the grill, so all I can see is the headlights, so I'm stuck there. But it's a sweet-looking car. Everybody, when you get out, go and look. You can't miss it all the way on the other side. And I was intending to go that way, the idea of restoration and how God can take and restore things and change our lives. But I've become convinced, in getting ready for today, that what God wants to restore most of all is our relationship with Him and with others. And so today we're going to talk about restoration from the perspective of the privilege of childship, of being God's child. And I think it goes at the really heart, the very core of who we are as people. And here's the question we want to get right to today. Who has the right to label something? Who has that right? And you think about all the different labels that get kind of stuck around. And one of the labels that is a very positive thing from the Bible, but sometimes in our way we deal with things, it doesn't always come out very positive, is the idea of being adopted. You know, the Bible basically tells us that none of us has a leg up spiritually. That if you were born into a loving Christian family, I mean a really good Christian family, a family that did everything right for you, that provided everything, that helped you get to know Jesus, to fall in love with Jesus, to follow Jesus your whole life, just being born in that family doesn't necessarily make you one of God's children. Just as the other way, that if you were born in a family that was very irreligious, that was a terrible family, that a family you can't even stand today because of all the memories and all the pain that you bring with you. The Bible and Jesus himself would say, it's not who you were born to or what your nationality is, even what your spiritual makeup was when you were born. It's really about the choice you make to respond to that invitation. And so this morning I want to talk a little bit about this idea of adoption, and I'll invite my friend Lindsay to come up. Everybody say good morning, Lindsay. Good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning.
I just want to make sure your mic's on. So I invited Lindsay up here because I think it's important. We were talking the other day, and I'm going to ask a question from everybody out there. How many of you have an older sibling? A lot of people have older siblings. And you have an older sibling, right?
Yep.
All right. Those of you who have older siblings, how many of you ever had your older sibling say to you, you were adopted? And when they said that, they didn't mean that as a positive thing for them. They made that as a negative thing. Now, it's not a negative thing, but for if you were in a family, it made you kind of go, what? I mean, you remember the feeling when you first heard that? It's like, what? What do you mean I'm adopted? You know, and it made you feel like you were rejected. Who did you belong to? But that's not. But I want you to know that there's a lot of people that have that experience. And you were adopted, right? Mm-hmm. Do you remember how old you were when you were adopted?
I was 10 months old.
10 months old?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, Lindsay, what is the best thing about being adopted?
I like telling the story of when I was adopted because sometimes people like to listen to it, and I just like telling stories.
Okay, and what's the story of you being adopted?
Well, someone abandoned me on the streets, and then the police picked me up and put me in an orphanage, and then my mom...
So you've been picked up by the police already,
mm-hmm.
at 10 months old?
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to check, okay. And they took you to an orphanage?
And there was a disease called SARS going around, and because of that, my mom and dad will put up on the list a little folder so that they can come and adopt me. So they came and adopted me, and yeah.
All right, so this big scary thing, the SARS, this kind of respiratory sickness that was going on, mm-hmm. They were keeping people from coming over, right?
Yep.
But your mom and dad were down the list, but because of that, they came to the top of the list, right?
Yep.
That's pretty sweet, Now, has anyone ever made fun of you because you're adopted?
No, they actually kind of think it's pretty cool.
Ah, okay. Well, that's good. And what does adopted mean to you, Lindsay?
I think think adopted means kind of like being chosen by someone to be their kid, their child.
Ah, that's a great idea. In fact, I want you to look up here. I put some synonyms. You know what a synonym is?
Yep.
Do you really? Mm-hmm. I just had to learn it this week. Do you know what a synonym is already? Yeah, it's called, synonym is thing, right? So here's some words that are the same as adopted. Don't laugh at me. You didn't know what a synonym was either. What did you do? It can mean that you're accepted. Same word. It can mean that you're approved. Same word. You can say I've been adopted or I've been approved. It can mean that you've been embraced. Or that they agreed that we've adopted this idea together. We've agreed on this idea together. Now here's an antonym. You know what an antonym, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which means the opposite, which means to be rejected. And that's not a good feeling, right? Mm-hmm. So the great thing is adopted means the opposite of being rejected, means you're taken in and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
That's great. Well, here's the question we started with. Who has the right to label something? And here's what I want you to know. I want you to think about this. Write these three things out. Here's who has the right. You know who has the right to label something?
A manufacturer?
The manufacturer, somebody who makes something, right? Look at my shirt there. Exist. Yeah, I think it's a Kohl's brand. It's not a very famous brand, but they're the maker of the shirt, so they have the right to label it. If I had I could have a little guy on a little horse, a little pony stick. That would mean who the maker is. Whoever makes something has the right to put their label on it because they made it, right?
Right.
Here's the second. Here's the other person who has the right to label something is?
An owner.
An owner. So, you have stuff at your house, right?
Uh-huh.
And if I came over to your house and I took a big black felt pen and I said, ooh, I like this, and I started writing my name on that, would that be okay?
No.
No. How come?
Because it was mine.
Because it's yours, that's right. Because I don't own it, right?
Right.
And so if you own something, you have a right to label it. You have the right to say, that's mine. And here's the third person who has the right to label something.
Purchaser.
A purchaser, right? So if you go buy something, you have the right to write your name on something so that if it gets lost, they can find it, right?
Uh-huh.
How many of you ever had your name written on any piece of clothing? Right? 'Cause that way, if it got lost, you could get back to you, right? Or if you got lost, it could get back to the right people. That kind of works there. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Everybody give Lindsay a hand, all right? I love the story from Lindsay because it reminds me of a good friend of my family who was adopted, and I just saw him before coming out here. His dad had passed away just on our trip out here. But I had a chance to see his dad for a few days before I moved, and had a chance to see Danny. I hadn't seen him in quite a few years. And he had been adopted. And he went through kind of a rough childhood and kind of went through something that sometimes happens for people that have been adopted of, why did my parents do this? And they kind of focus on all the bad. But thankfully, over the course of his life, and Danny's probably about 40 years old now, he's at the point of saying, it wasn't about who abandoned me, it's about who chose me. And it was great to see some of the things that he wrote for his dad's funeral service. Just the idea that, here's my dad, he was my dad because he chose me. And the reality is, that's kind of God's perspective on things. You're not God's just because you got born in his family. You are God's, if you're God's, because you were adopted into his family. So who has the right to label you? Is maybe a more important question. Not who has the right to label something, but who has the right to label you? And the truth of the matter is, all of us carry labels. Some we put on ourselves, some others have put on us, and we drag them throughout life. And we carry them along. But here's my question today. What if you are carrying the wrong labels in your life? I mean, think about the labels that sometimes get thrown at us. Some of us. Athletic, I like to label myself that. Don't laugh. It's a true label. I don't label myself this, but if you want to, I'll go along with that, right? You may not say this word, but it has been applied to us at times, or at least to me at times. have a whole mess of them. Some of you wish that was the label you had attached to you. But if you've ever been on the other end of it, it's not a label. In fact, growing up, I wasn't called skinny, but I was literally the runt of my family and of most of the grades I was in school. I didn't get a growth spurt until I was between junior and senior years. Up to that, I was a little point guard in basketball, and I came back my senior year, and I was like playing center. I went this spurt. But I've always been the runt, the skinny one out of the group. And you may look at me today and say, Mike, that's not possible. If you saw my brother, you would say, yes, it's possible. And my dad and all of his cousins were all basically the same size, all about 6'3", and all about 240, 250. My brother's probably about 300 pounds. And for me, it's something that has driven me a lot of my life. To not be skinny, not be thin, not stand this way and have people not be able to see me. I've taken care of that with a little Ben & Jerry's, but that's a whole other story. But you think about the labels that get stuck and how they impact our life, how they literally can drive us. Some of us use it to drive and become better, not be these things anymore. And other of us, that becomes the thing that just sticks with us our whole life. Some are labels we can't do anything about. You can't do anything about it if you're young. You can't do anything about it if you're old. Maybe you're an employee. Maybe you're a boss. Maybe you're just bossy. But think about those labels. And who has the right to label you? Think of the people who have tried to label you in your life. Maybe it's a sibling. Those lovely siblings, right? Maybe it was a parent. Maybe a teacher. Maybe a coach. Maybe a friend. Or maybe somebody who thought was a friend, but it wasn't a friend. There's so many different labels that get stuck and applied to our lives. And here's interesting. The label you carry around, the label that maybe has defined your life, isn't necessarily the label that God has for you. Galatians and Paul just captures this very simple idea when he says God sent him, talking about Jesus, to buy freedom for us so that he could adopt us as his very own children. One of the reasons Jesus came to die was to give us the opportunity to be adopted, to purchase us, to adopt us as his very own children. And here's what I want you to write down. Who has the right to label you? The one who made you, owns you, and purchased you. And if you're young enough, I want you to just kind of listen to me just for a moment. Because literally, how you answer that question, who has the right to label you, and to know how God looks at you and can label you, can literally change your future. Because there are people sitting around you right at this moment that wish they could go back to their elementary school or their middle school years or their high school years or their college years or to some part of their life and change some things. To somehow shed those labels. To not let a word that somebody said, that comment somebody made that stuck, that didn't slide off our backs like so many others did. That would love to go back and have a rewiring about how we have seen life and how we have gone with life from that moment. And so if you're young, I just want to encourage you, if you can get this right now, it literally will make your life so much better. And if you're past those ages, I want to remind you today that there's still hope. That all those labels are just that, they're labels. But the only one who has the right to label you is the one who has made you, is the one who owns you, and is the one who purchased you. And if you are a believer, if you are a follower of Jesus, he has done those three things for you. You have recognized, you have validated that he has made you. You are validating that he owns you. You are validating that he purchased you and adopted you into his family. And if we get this right, it will change your future. And to tell you this, let's go over to the story of a guy named Zacchaeus over in Luke chapter 19. It says this man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. Now, if you've read much of your Bibles, of the portions about Jesus' life, the parts that we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you know that oftentimes Jesus got criticized for hanging around with people, certain kinds of people. And if you remember, there's this line that goes, he was criticized for hanging around with sinners and tax collectors. Which ought to tell us something today about how people viewed tax collectors back then, right? I mean, they knew who sinners were. Sinners were this category of the people that were just, they were bad. Everybody agreed they were sinners. They were the prostitutes. They were the town drunks. They were the people that did this outrageous stuff publicly, and everybody knew about it. But tax collectors were considered so bad that the sinners didn't even want to have them part of their group. We're sinners, but we're not tax collectors. Because tax collectors had literally sold out their nation, sold out their people. They kind of bought into this franchise. We'll collect taxes, we'll take from our own people, and we'll keep some for ourselves. We'll get rich off our own people who are paying for this government that's come in to take over things. And it says here he was a chief tax collector, which in the real term, he was a tax farmer, which simply meant he was kind of head over a bunch of franchises. Brian had a franchise, Sandra had a franchise, and I'd come along and I'd say, hey, where's my cut today, Brian? Sandra, where's my cut today? Good, you guys keep doing your thing. And the Roman government was supportive of that. I could have a group of Roman guards with me, so I was tough and bad. So when you hear the story of this guy named Zacchaeus, you recognize right away that he was not a beloved figure. In fact, he was pretty hated. But not only was he a chief tax collector, he was wealthy. You know how most of us feel about people being wealthy, right? It's great if it's me, but if it's you, I wonder what you did to get that money. Who you sold out, who you stuck it to, who you inherited it from, because surely you didn't earn it yourself, right? And then the story goes on and says, Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to see who he was. But he was too short of a man, so he couldn't. So because of the crowd, he couldn't see things. And if you've been around, little kids' classes, Sabbath school classes, there's this little song, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man and a... Talk about a label, right? Nathan, we'd say he had short man's complex, right? And if you've ever been around someone like that, you know that there's sort of this overcompensation, just like so many labels. You get stuck with something and you try to overcompensate. And apparently Zacchaeus had decided the best way to overcompensate was to go in the tax farming system, to own these franchises, and to get back at all those people who had made fun of him because he was a little bitty guy. But Jesus shows up in a town, and Zacchaeus wants to see what's going on. So Zacchaeus can't see because of the crowd. Excuse me, I can't see anything. So he runs ahead, which is really weird because, in those society, a man doesn't run. You have a woman go fetch things for you, you have a kid go fetch things for you, but a man doesn't run. But not only does he run, he climbs this sycamore fig tree. He gets up in a tree, which is pretty embarrassing, right? I want you guys that are over 40 for a moment to think about climbing up in a tree. Kind of a great sight, right, Mike? You're trying to get up and he can't quite get up. And this guy's short, too, so he's, somebody moves a branch, he can't quite get up there. But he's trying to get up there. I want you to get this point, that Zacchaeus has been labeled. Partly through his own stuff, he's a chief tax collector. Partly through being wealthy, everybody knew he was wealthy, so he probably kind of flashed it around a little bit in their faces. But he was also short. But he was willing to do some things that put him even farther out there. Because you know how when you see somebody who does something that just isn't the normal, everybody goes, yeah, money's gone to his head. I mean, you look at him, he's just crazy. He's running around here, climbing up trees, And when Jesus reaches the spot, he looks up, sees Zacchaeus in the tree, and I'm not sure whether he has a smile on his face, has a giggle when he says these words, but he says, Zacchaeus, you need to come down, dude. Because remember back then they wore dresses, and he's like, you just need to come down, right? But I must stay at your house today. That's a mind blower for Zacchaeus. He was just trying to get up in the tree so he could see who Jesus was. Heard lots of stuff about him. He just wanted to see who Jesus was, and Jesus stops and says, hey, come on down, because I'm going to your house today. had to be the moment, the highlight of Zacchaeus' life. Here's this short, hated, rich, all the other things, foolish guy, and Jesus is going to his house. To which the crowd just welcomes him. It says he comes down and at once, welcomes him gladly. There's this, great connection between Jesus and Zacchaeus. He puts his arm around Zacchaeus, and they walk to his house. And here's what the crowd says. All the people saw this and began to mutter. You ever have the joy of being in a crowd that mutters? And look what he says. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. What kind of guy is this guy, Jesus? I mean, apparently it's pretty evident. Everybody knows who Zacchaeus is, and apparently whatever outfit he's wearing kind of gives the hint of who he is. And they can't stand the idea. They can't stand the idea that Jesus makes time for Zacchaeus. They can't stand the idea that Jesus would go to Zacchaeus' house. Because to be around a traitor in their culture meant you sort of took on that trait. This whole idea of being unclean that the Old Testament talks about, and the Jews kind of took a few steps beyond that. And so if you were just in their presence, it sort of like wipes off on you. And if it wipes off on you, you're unclean for a certain amount of time. And here's Jesus going and becoming unclean with this short little guy who's gotten filthy rich off of my money and your money. And you all know how we feel about the government, right? And that's how they felt about Zacchaeus. Took their money, didn't represent them, represented this government, and never did anything great for them. He's gone to be the guest of this sinner. But as they get there, Zacchaeus stands up, and it says something amazing. He says, look, Lord, he's talking to Jesus. He says, look, Jesus, here and now, at this moment, I give half of my possessions to the poor. Think about that for a second. Half of his possession. In that moment, he has pledged to be 50% less wealthy. He's just chopped it in half. And he's done this publicly. This is not a quiet kind of thing. He's saying, Lord, look here now, I'm going to give you half. I'm going to give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody, had he cheated anybody? Of course he cheated somebody. We all know how governments are. Tax collectors are. They cheat everybody. If you cheat anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a math major to figure out this guy is taken from being a wealthy guy to not being very wealthy in just a moment. And I want you to notice something. Jesus does not say to him, come on, Zacchaeus, that's okay. You're forgiven. All's good. Don't worry about all that stuff. Jesus just looks at him. And I have to imagine with a smile on his face. Because here's this short little guy. Filthy rich. Maybe he's got furs on. I don't know. Got jewelry. He's all decked out. Maybe he's got a crown because he thinks so highly of himself. I don't know what the story. But he's standing there. And he makes this incredible profession. This incredible commitment at that moment. And Jesus simply says, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. Everybody looked at him as not a son of Abraham. They looked at him as a son of the devil. But Jesus looks at him and says, no. He too, just like the rest of you around here claiming to be sons of Abraham, he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man, Jesus says, I came to seek and save what was lost. And I have to believe that Zacchaeus was lost, not just because of his own actions. That was part of it. But he was lost a lot of times because of the labels that got put on him. He was short. Maybe he was greedy. Maybe he was awkward when he was around other people. He ran and climbed trees. See, the reality and the embarrassment your label reflects is not an obstacle to God's grace. the label you carry at this moment, that got plastered on you early on or plastered on you just this last week, is not an obstacle to God's grace. In fact, grace allows us to honestly face and accept our past without being controlled by it. So often, I run into people and they'll tell me this just terrible stories of their past. I mean, things that you wouldn't wish on anybody. Sometimes it's from poor choices made. Oftentimes it's from poor choices other people made that affected them. And they'll say, Mike, I just wish I wish that my past could just leave me. I wish I could just erase it all. And I try to always remind them that maybe what God's trying to do is not to erase your past, but is to restore your past, to redeem your past, to let your past be a testimony of what God can do in someone's life. Who are you going to allow to label you? And who has the right to label you? See, if you are a child of God, if you are adopted into his family, from God's point, that changes everything. And I would just say to you, if you have sort of built up walls around yourself to keep the bad guys out, to recognize that those walls also can keep the good guys out. Even before he made the world, God loved us and chose us in Christ to be holy and without fault in his eyes. Just let that sink in for a moment. Before anything was made on this planet, God already saw you, God already knew you, and he offered that invitation. He chose you to be holy. And holy here doesn't mean to be perfect. It simply means to be set apart for God. And I love that last part. Without fault in his eyes. God has chosen you to be without fault in his eyes. Not just simply because of the things you do and don't do, but because of the way that he looks at you. His unchanging plan has always been to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. That's God's unchanging plan. Has always been to adopt us into his family. Because again, it doesn't matter how you started out, and I know some of you are trying to have great and wonderful homes, where all your child ever knows is a loving home and a loving God. And I give you lots of credit, and I hope that it works out that way for you. But you need to know that isn't going to guarantee that child becomes a child of God. It's about whether they'll be adopted into that family. Because Jesus had multiple arguments where he had to say, listen guys, it's not just because you're a Jew that you're okay. Which kind of got them ticked off a little bit. Who do you think you're talking about? What you talking about, Jesus? Which Jesus would say, well, you are a lot like your father. Just your father is not Abraham. Don't make me say it, but yeah, it's the devil. And of course, they get really ticked off with that because they were relying on their genealogy. They were relying on their heritage. They were relying on, this is the family I was raised in. And Jesus says, it isn't about that. It's about God choosing you. That his unchanging plan has always been to adopt us into his family. And if you were a follower of Jesus, if you have responded to that, you are an adopted child. And your father, no matter how good or how terrible your earthly father was, has now been replaced by a perfect father who has always loved you, always cared for you. And I love this last line. And this idea of his unchanging plan to adopt his family gave him great pleasure. It is oftentimes hard for me to think of God looking down and smiling at me on occasion. Sometimes it's hard to think that God would just adopt me, take me as I am. But it is the clear testimony of the Bible. God's plan has always been to adopt us to make us one with him, to make us part of his family. And being one with him and being part of his family ought to change everything for us. Because it's not about the labels we've gotten. It's not about labels that maybe are valid. It's about the one who has the right to label you. The one who has made you, the one who owns you, and the one who purchased you. See, in God's story, you are the focus of a celebration. I mean, Jesus says this. Anytime anyone responds to me, we throw a party in heaven. I mean, that's an incredible thought, isn't it? When anytime somebody responds to Jesus, Jesus says, we throw a party in heaven. I have to hope that there's this ongoing party atmosphere in heaven all the time. That isn't like, man, it is late. It is like midnight tonight. Well, these kids ought to be in bed. We're not having a party. We'll do the party. No, we're throwing a party now. I mean, it's just got to be this ongoing party because they don't want to put off celebrating when somebody becomes part of their family. They become adopted into it. And the reality is, at any given moment, you have the power to say, this is not how the story is going to end. And you need to know that today. Because I don't know how your story has gone, but I know somebody here today needs to know that you have the power within yourselves to respond to that invitation of God's adoption and not have the story end the way it's going to end if you don't do something. John simply puts it this way. See what an incredible quality of love the Father has given, shown, bestowed on us. That we should be permitted to be named and called and counted the children of God. And so we are. There's something about knowing that your parent loves you. There's something about hearing those words that you're accepted. For the last about 6 years, I've been part of a big Easter production. And it was members not just only from our church, but from other churches there. We had people that were involved that weren't Christians, weren't believers in anything. But it was a great opportunity to have them involved and get them around, followers of Jesus and just see what took place. And a few years back, we had a guy named Wayne who came on, and he had done some local theater, and we were looking for somebody to play the part of Satan because the guy had played the part of Satan, and the whole Easter theme was getting kind of tired of playing that role because it's a pretty tough role to play. And it's pretty bad because when people left, they would typically, some old ladies with their canes would hit the people that that played the devil, or sometimes the Roman guard. So he was kind of tired of that. And Wayne had come along, and he didn't have any problem playing the devil because he didn't believe in any of that stuff anyways. So we said, great, you're our man then, So Wayne took it on, and the very first year he was part of it, he lived in Portland, and his dad lived in the Portland area, and his dad lived up in the Seattle area, about 2.5, 3 hours away. And so he told his dad he was doing this brand new production, and Dad came down Saturday night, went to the production, and Sunday night when I got there, we did it Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night. Sunday night, as soon as I got in there, was getting ready to get changed in our costume, somebody said, hey, have you talked to Wayne tonight? And I was like, no, I haven't seen him yet. He said, you need to go talk to Wayne. I mean, he had something pretty incredible happen last night. So I said, okay. So I went, try to find out where he's at, and he was back in this one little spot. He was all kind of made up in his black costume and all the makeup and stuff. And I said, hey, Wayne, how's it going? Are you enjoying your first year doing this? And he says, Mike, I got to tell you what happened last night. He said, my dad came, and he says, my dad occasionally comes to my productions and watches them, but, just kind of comes and says, that was okay. And he said, when he came out last night, when I was in the lobby, he came up to me and he grabbed my arm. And he said to me, son, don't ever stop doing this. He said, it was unbelievable. And he said, my dad had tears in his eyes. He said, my dad's not a religious guy. And then he said, my dad looked at me, I had his hold of my arm, and he said, son, I'm so proud of you. I love you. And here's the part that killed me. Wayne was probably around 50 years old. He said, Mike, that is the first time I ever heard my dad say that he was proud of me or that he loved me. That's a sad story. I was glad that we could be part of creating that kind of environment. But I want you to know today that if you never had a parent say they're proud of you, you never had a parent say that they love you, don't let that label stick. Because you have a parent that is proud of you. You have a parent that does love you. See what kind of love, this awesome love that God has bestowed on us, that we should be permitted, be named, called, and counted children of God. And so we are. So we are. Saw this on Facebook this week, which I thought was a great quote. One day someone is going to hug you so tight that all of your broken pieces will stick back together. In my mind, that captures what God wants to do for each of us. Because we all know when we were children, sticks and stones don't break your bones. Or do break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And we know how stupid that was because we know that wasn't true, right? But we said it enough trying to hope that it was true, but it never was true. Well, the thing that is true is the day can be the day that someone can hug you so tight that they can put all those pieces back together. Because God is not only in the adoption business, he is also in the restoration business.